Good morning, good afternoon. It's really wonderful to welcome all of you to what I have no doubt will be a fascinating and very engaging conversation. I'm Leslie Vinjamori. I direct the U.S. and Americas program here at Chatham House, where I'm also dean of our Queen Elizabeth II Academy. It is a tremendous honor to be hosting this discussion on U.S. competitiveness and the future of technology governance. This is clearly not a new area, but the urgency that I think we now all feel is clear. The conversation today is taking place at a time of intensified competition in a sector, in an area where there is rapid development, feels like nearly every day. And at a time and in a context where there is political and geopolitical tension that we at Chatham House are all very, very well aware of. Today's discussion, I'm very happy to say, is on the record. And we are joined by two individuals who will be very well known to our audiences and to the world. Eric Schmidt is an accomplished technologist, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. He is best known to us as CEO and chair of Google, later Alphabet, between the years of 2001 and 2018. But he's also very well known to many of us for his public service. He was, between 2016 and 2020, chair of the Innovation Board at the Department of Defense. He was, until very recently, chair of the U.S. National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And Eric, you have clearly been a very dedicated and committed philanthropist, giving back to many of America's leading institutions, the Mayo Clinic, MIT, and since 2017, you have been co-founder and leader at Schmidt Futures, which is something that's very of great interest to those of us, certainly at the Academy for Leadership here at Chatham House. You're also author of many books, including the forthcoming book in November with Henry Kissinger and Daniel Huttenlocher on the age of artificial intelligence. So I'm very glad that we've gotten you now, because it seems to be the case that once the books come out, it's very hard to get people like yourself. So thank you so much for joining us. I know that you are joining because you and Fred have a long-standing professional, but also friendship. And so I should say a few words about Fred. Fred is very well known to us also as as being a leader in the private sector, the public sector, in philanthropy and human rights. But Fred, more importantly, is a friend, a dear friend of Chatham House. He's been very engaged with us over the course, at least of the last 3.5 years. He's best known across the United States and far beyond as having been the president and chair of the Export-Import Bank between 2009 and 2017, but also in the Clinton administration, you've been deeply committed to supporting small businesses. You were once a dean of the Milano School of International Affairs at the New School in New York City. And you're author of a recent book, Trade is Not a Four-Letter Word, which is, of course, the title says it all. So over to the two of you. For a conversation on such an incredibly important area. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the audience. We'll have about 30 minutes of conversation, and then we will open it up to all of you. And we are, once again, I'll say we're on the record. Welcome and thank you.
Oh, thank you, Leslie, and thank you all the colleagues at Chatham House and Robin, and most importantly, thank you, Eric, for agreeing to spend an hour or so together. So we'll have about a half hour that Eric and I will just go through a number of subjects that perhaps that will prompt questions in the Q&A, or you may think of a question that we left out. So to organize this, I thought about the 4 C's, COVID, chips, China, and some cookies, which I purchased this morning. I will refrain from eating one until I get to the cookie section. So starting with COVID, Eric and I met during the Obama years. Eric was frequently brought in by President Obama on a number of task force that I got to know Eric during that time when I was chair of XM. But at the dawn of this pandemic, we were neighbors in Florida, and I remember looking at some of the tracking data as COVID was and the pandemic was increasing. How can we think about technology in the future to sort of do a better job of addressing something like this pandemic? Because there is a sense the next one will not take 100 years to arrive like this one did from 1918 to the present day pandemic. And all these lockdowns, essentially, many of the lockdowns meant we did not get control of the pandemic. If we had control, we would not have had to lock down society. So could you talk a little bit how we might use technology to sort of really address what is a real threat to the world right now?
Well, thank you. And it's great to be back at Chatham House, which an institution that I've worked with and admired for many, many years. Fred has been a close friend for, I think, 15 years, Fred. And he's also a fantastic human being, a fantastic neighbor, and a fantastic public servant. And we found that we agreed on a lot of things. If I take a look at COVID, I conclude some pretty horrific conclusions. And they're not the ones that you think. 25% of the deaths of COVID have been in the United States, roughly 25% of the cases as measured in the current 20% in the cases as measured are in the United States. How is that possible that such an advanced country as the United States could do so poorly? Today, to show you the idiocy of this, we don't allow Europeans to come to America, even though European vaccination rates are far, far higher than they are in the United States, especially in Britain, where Leslie is and everybody else is. So there's something wrong. And let's just say it's just wrong. And I've been trying to figure out the root of this. And I think much of it, of course, starts with political leadership that decided to take a health crisis and turn it into sort of a political battle, but also the systems and platforms that I represent were very significant contributors to this. And we have a problem that the systems that we're building in information are getting very good at targeting your preferences. And not all human behavior is rational and logical. I'm sorry, if you're a libertarian, it's just true. People have recency bias, they have anchoring bias, they have fearful behaviors, they can easily be swayed, especially if it's a secret and so forth. And these systems are being used in a way that was certainly not the intention of the designers of these systems. So when the history books come out, this is going to be a pretty bad period in American history. And in case you're confused about this, the death rate in the United States is about 2,000 a day. Think about that number. The death rate in Florida, which is the highest death rate per state for many of the last few months, has been well close to 500. And in Miami, where Fred and I were, the death rate is proportionally very, very high. And it's typically white, older, relatively uneducated, and unvaccinated people. So presumably the base that President Trump was targeting at. There's something wrong. With respect to the science, there are many people who believe that we have the technology now to do rapid development of answers to new, essentially new emergent variants. And there are calls in legislation to build biosurveillance systems so we can actually watch it. When this COVID started, we didn't actually understand what was going on. We didn't have any way of testing. We didn't have the kind of observational systems to see the disease spread. Even today, the estimates of Delta coverage in the United States are estimates, whereas Britain, for example, has a much more significant way of doing biological forecasting. So overall, the political dysfunction in the United States has led to death rates that are equal to or greater to every war that we have fought. Something's wrong. We need to address it.
As you and you know, I think of so much of the rest of the world. Here we developed all the vaccines, and we have so many Americans who don't want to take it, which must be perplexing to so many people outside our borders.
As far as I know, people don't want to kill their own kids, and so if the messaging were, if you get this, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to harm your own family, I think it would change. But right. It's not my job to figure out how to message it. My job is to say that this is unacceptable. It will go a dark period in American history. There's plenty of blame to go around among all the political leaders, scientists, and what have you. I'll give you another point, which is, I think, relevant. we're okay now because of a unique partnership between universities, the private sector, and the government. Specifically, under Trump, Operation Warp Speed pre-bought, without even a test of competency, in an international emergency, supplies to get the supply chain going for these vaccines. The vaccines, the mRNA ones, were largely developed in labs in the United States and in Europe. Indeed, the Pfizer vaccine in Europe is seen largely as a European solution. The two of them are revolutionary in terms of vaccine development. The acceleration occurred because the government and the private sector and the universities worked collaboratively in a time of national emergency. If we had not done that, we would be in deep doo-doo globally. Think about the death rate if we had not done that. What that tells me is if we go to other problems, such as climate change, where everyone spends all their time talking about it, the fact of the matter is we're going to have the same failure because you have collective action problems. And the solution to things like climate change and perhaps others will be these unique partnerships in a very specific goal where the government, the private sector, and the universities work together. That's the fastest way to solve the problem. And I'm convinced with COVID and now with upcoming climate change, it's going to be the only way to solve these problems.
Just managing our time, let me, I'm going to jump to my second area I wanted to ask you about, which is chips, as opposed to potato chips or Doritos. There's been a lot of talk of late about the chip shortage, slowing availability of new automobiles. We talk about the Internet of Things as something that's coming down. The chips generally come from Southeast Asia, Taiwan, Korea. There's a lot of move to do onshoring of chips in terms of supply chains. Give us your perspective on that. How should we look at that? Is that the right solution, or how should we look at that?
Well, Fred, you spent your whole career working on the benefits of globalization, globalized supply chains, and financing them. You understand this as well as anyone I've ever met. So what I would suggest is that onshoring, that is breaking the global supply chain, is simply a tax. And let me give you an example. I have a friend who works in the automobile industry in Europe. And in Europe, there is a deadline of 100% electric cars by 2035. So in order to do this, the industry, which is up in arms over it, is busy building battery factories, which are being subsidized by the government. And the estimates are that the construction cost of these cars, at least initially, will be up to a factor of 2 than the current ones. So it's a very straightforward question. We agree that we need to deal with climate change, and we agree that it will cost. Are you willing to spend a factor of 2? Okay. I was in a meeting yesterday on chips where another friend of mine was doing the math, and he said that US manufactured semiconductors, now this may or not be true, but this was what he told me yesterday, is 40% more expensive on a per unit cost than in Southeast Asia. Which shouldn't surprise you, because that's why the US got out of this 15 years ago in the first place.
Exactly.
Now, are you willing to spend 40% more for the chips to have them manufactured in the United States? And it's important to know, by the way, the answer in my view is yes, but I'm trying to phrase it in such a way that people can say it's a choice. So if you don't want to be dependent on Southeast Asia, then you have to spend 40% more for the chips. That's okay, by the way, because the strategic value for our country of having control over our own supply chain for something as critical as chips is worth it. But that's the price. So stop running around and saying, look, we've got to do this and that. Just tell me what it costs, and I'll tell you if it's important. I'll give you another example. In the military has specialized needs. I won't go into the details, but basically the chips they made are made in a different way that they're, shall we say, more resilient in the battle, right? That's the way to understand it. By the way, it costs a lot. The military pays that cost because the mission defines it. It needs it. You can't have the airplane flying around and the chip just sort of fail randomly. The industry is willing to pay the extra cost. And I think the truth is that what we're discovering is that for key critical parts of our infrastructure, we're going to have to pay that extra cost. I think it's okay. Economists like yourself, Fred, will figure out where that line is, but I think we should do it.
Okay, that's great clarity around that because and also we have to look at what is the cost of the chip as a percent of the entire
Of course.
thing we're buying. So it's not like the total cost is up 40%. The cost of that component is up 40%, and other components may be less expensive. So
and I should say, by the way, that my whole industry is focused on the leading edge chips, which are made largely in a factory in Taiwan called TSMC. If you purchase an Apple M1, for example, you're using a wonderful chip that they built with TSMC that runs at 5 nanometers. Smaller is better. The car industry, for example, uses 200 nanometer chips. So they're inexpensive and plentiful and not particularly a problem to have it be slightly more expensive. So it depends on where you are in the supply chain. Strategically, in our AI commission, we recommended strongly that the United States stay ahead of mainland China 2 generations in chips. And we supported in our commission decisions that the Trump administration made with respect to restricting access to certain chip manufacturing hardware, which is a burden for China and her development. So strategically, if you think of the conflict between China and the United States, there's a set of things we're going to have control over. Chips are clearly one of them. So Fred, you asked exactly the right question. Are there others, right? So for example, do we need to control steel? Well, we actually have steel. Do we need to control farming? Well, we actually have farming. Do we need to control oil? No, we have oil. Make the list and figure out what we don't have enough of. Can we get through the world without having more perfume? It would be a disaster, but yes, we can get through it, right? So it depends. It's what you need versus what you want.
Right. I mean, just back to our first subject, and I comment on this, in terms of COVID, we do not have to make masks and gowns in this country because all we need to do is make sure we have enough inventory. We're not going to be, and we should not be stockpiling ventilators because the next pandemic may not require ventilators. So
ventilators don't work very well either.
And they don't work very well, right? So, well, it's hard to talk about technology without talking about China, which is my third C. We're either full on or certainly heading into a very bifurcated world, a world of decoupling, a sort of a China and a West or US dominated sort of technologies. And I know that, and we have many people joining us today from the UK and from Europe that also feel somewhat caught between having to choose between the two. One, is this inevitable, or is there a way to square the circle and find a way to make it work, or do we really going to have to just go our separate ways?
When I started working on the China question, which is about 4 years ago, I was convinced that this would end up in decoupling. I'm no longer convinced of it. And here's why. If you look at the numbers, we are more dependent on each other than ever. So my own prediction of how this will play out is that we're going to have incredibly uncomfortable partnerships with China. And when I say uncomfortable, I mean really uncomfortable. China will do things that we don't like, things that we are annoyed about, things that we complain about, but we're not going to disconnect from them. There's simply too much of a dependency on both sides on it. So in the United States, what will happen is that some things will become more onshored. We use chips as an example. There's a few others. And that's, I think, fairly straightforward, but that's a small percentage of the total trade. The total trade will grow, even though it becomes more uncomfortable because of the strategic concerns. But the tactics of trade, something, Fred, that you built in your whole career, are going to continue. I believe the same thing is true for Europe. And I think people are beginning to understand that this is how life is going to be. And I'll give you an example. For the majority of the countries in the world, and in particular for European countries, they're now in a situation where there's more trade with China than the United States, and there's more dependency in terms of goods than the United States. No business in Germany, for example, wants the German chancellor to say, you can't trade with China. It would have a huge impact on their business, on their economy, on their employees, and so forth. So there's enormous pressure to maintain that. So you're going to see tension in the form of the United States is going to say to Germany, you're part of our protection domain. You can't do this. And then there'll be a list of things that are allowed. So for example, the Germans want to sell cars to China. That will probably be okay because that will be seen as non-strategic. But there will be other technologies which are important for national security, for example, where there'll be enormous pressure from the United States to prevent it. Let me give you an example of a hard problem, or actually two. The two biggest and most successful exports out of China, strategic exports right now, are TikTok and Huawei. Now, why is TikTok strategic? Well, TikTok is by far the most successful platform for teenagers today around the world, and especially in the United States. How do you feel about the Chinese having control over that? Maybe you're okay with it. Maybe it's not a problem, but it's a new problem. With Huawei, Huawei, and the history is well understood, started by copying without permission work at Cisco, built an enormous infrastructure, all in a town. It's an incredibly sized company with huge reach. And it has the benefit of better technology in 5G in many areas and state support, plus a very strong pro 5G, the correct frequencies essentially in China. So we have very strong Chinese leadership in 5G. So if the United States calls up Europe and says you can't use Huawei because it's full of holes, which by the way it is. That's a good example of how this plays out. And the problem on the United States side is that the United States at the time did not have a good answer as what the alternative is. Now they're working on that. But that's a good example where the question of strategic leadership is important. Because of failures, which included failures in the Obama administration, the Bush administration, Trump administration, and so forth, we ended up in a situation where the Chinese 5G networks are at least a factor of 10 stronger than they are in the United States. That's a strategic problem. That's losing. And we collectively, we as a country, we as the West, need a much stronger answer, and we don't have that today.
And I mean, is part of the impediment to that is, we have a much more sort of, still compared to the rest of the world, I know there are critics, but, a much more sort of free enterprise, less government engagement. We seem to have a certain allergic reaction to that, at least in the United States. So is that an impediment, you think, here, or a stumbling block?
Yeah, I think people don't understand the history of how all this stuff happened. The GPS was funded by the US government. DARPA was funded by the US government.
Right. Exactly.
This guy named Vannevar Bush set up post-World War II, the National Science Foundation, and a whole bunch of other things that were federally supported. When I was a graduate student in computer science, I was supported by the National Science Foundation and DARPA. I couldn't have afforded it on my own. So the role of government in these strategic technologies to at least get them started in the right direction is without doubt. Now, you could say you're antithetical to government intervention. So you hate the government, but virtually every piece of technology that you use was created by funding from the government. So in our AI commission, we state this very clearly, that we're now in a competition with China over AI. AI is going to define, and we talk about this in our book as well, AI is going to change everything. We don't want to lose that, like we're busy losing 5G. So in particular, we need to spend a lot more money on research, do a lot more things like allow immigration, high skills immigration into the United States, and these sorts of things. So we don't lose the most important technology for the next 50 years, which is going to be artificial intelligence.
Right. And also, I know you've spoken recently, just the impact of AI and defense and national security is a very critical area that, we think about AI as helping doctors diagnose diseases and things like that. We think of the more beneficial ones, but there are a number of dark sides to AI that we just seem to be scratching the surface on. Is that a fair assessment?
What I would say is that all of these technologies are dual use. So they can be used and they're enormously powerful, or they can be misused. So let's look at some of the really positive uses. In our book, which is called The Age of AI, I'll plug it now. It's coming out on November 2nd.
I bought my copy already. I already have a pre-order.
Oh, thank you. We love this. So in the book, we highlight a couple of extraordinary achievements. There's a drug called Halcyon in MIT. And the way it was designed was the computer scientists programmed with the synthetic biologist to look at 100 million compounds and discover on its own how they work together. Right? That's the key thing. It wasn't told this is how they work. It discovered how the compounds interacted. And based on that, they did a selection screen where they looked for something which was created an antibiotic response, but was also very different from the existing ones. And they have a candidate that looks very good. That is a remarkable achievement. We highlighted another example. We highlighted a win in a game called Go, which is played in Asia. And the AI system called AlphaGo invented new moves that had not been thought of in 2,500 years by humans. That's a pretty big deal. We also highlight the development of something called GPT-3, which is a universal model. And what it does is it sucks all the language that's out there, in this case on Wikipedia and on the internet, and then it learns how language works and it learns facts. And it can generate conversations and biographies and so forth in a completely new way. Many people think that that is the next step to general intelligence. So those are three good examples in gaming and strategy, in healthcare, and then in language and intelligence, where we're seeing these enormous gains with tremendous amount of money coming in. So you know it's going to go to its natural limit. On the other hand, let me give you a couple of examples. I can imagine in the future the following war. North Korea decides to attack the United States. North Korea launches the attack. The United States fights back and fights back well. And China sees this and says, this is going to upset the order. And using the power that China has, it stops the North Korean attack. And the Americans are grateful. That entire war took 3 milliseconds to happen. The key issue with AI and these computers is the compression of time, and this is not understood. And we talk about this in the book at great length. I'll give you another example. The military has a doctrine, which I worked on, which is basically man in the middle, man in the loop, or human in the loop, where they want human control of life critical things. Makes perfect sense, right? You don't want random stuff happening. You don't want random missiles launching and things like that. It's obviously destabilizing, and I can take you through all the scenarios. So here we are, we're on a ship, we've got a hypersonic missile coming at us. The computer system detects this, the humans can't see it. And the computer says, Mr. and Mrs. Commander, you have 28 seconds to press this button. And if you don't press this button within 28 seconds, you're dead. Now, what human's not going to press that button? So in the military, we've organized conflict around human reaction times. But a lot of the really important strategic moves in conflict are going to occur with less time. I don't think anyone has really thought through the implications of this. I've certainly not encountered it in the literature. And how will we organize when the wars are just like that? And the insights are just like that. And one of the things to understand about AI is that, and we say this in the book, again, plugging the book, the technology is imprecise, it makes mistakes. It is dynamic in the sense that it's changing. It is emergent in that when you combine things, things happen that you don't expect. And it's learning. So it's learning as it goes. We've never had a technology in our hands or in our opponent's hands that has that criteria. We don't have a doctrine. We don't have an agreement among the nation states as to how to limit these technologies, and we need it. We need to find the most obvious one is to agree not to do launch on warning, right? In other words, to not allow that kind of fast cycle I just described.
Right.
Do you really think the United States would lead diplomacy in that area? Do you really think China would agree to it? Do you really think Russia would agree to it? I don't think we know.
Right. And we have not been in a period of great finding common ground and cooperation in a number of areas. And the pandemic is one of them even. China's opaqueness.
And the Chinese are never going to admit to the details of anything. They're not even admitting what happened in COVID. Dr. Kissinger tells the following story, and he'll say this, it's a bit in the book, and he'll also say this on the book tour. In the way that actually, the reason we're all alive today is that after World War II and the use of the 2 nuclear weapons, there was a group that started working on policy in the early 1950s that he was a part of. And he was a very young faculty member at Harvard. And it was all the the iconic people of the time, all the top physicists and so forth. And they came up with the doctrines of containment, counting, restrictions, and so forth. And it took years. And this was in the context of the Soviets versus the America in the 1950s. We need to do that in AI now before there's the kind of incident like Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Moving to a quick and perhaps lighter subject, cookies. And I have my strawberry cookie right here. I assume the term cookies came from Little Red Riding Hood. Is that where the term comes from? And who made up such a term?
The original origin of the term cookie in browsers was invented in Netscape because they had to put a tracking, essentially stub, inside the Netscape browser, and then it became part of all the other browsers. That was roughly 1992. I know because I was part of it.
So one of the things that's challenging is right now, in the guise of privacy and protection, you have to agree to cookies. And on many sites, if you don't agree, you're locked out. So there's an apparent choice, but not really a choice. So, and that doesn't make everybody feeling very comfortable or trustworthy. So how can we make that more consumer friendly, more understandable to the average user?
So in Europe, about 15 years ago, there were a series of legal challenges. I know because I was dealing with them at the time, which ultimately led to a regulatory rule that for every web page, you had to accept the use of cookies. Essentially, no European to first order understands what a cookie actually does. The privacy people do. And so you get a situation which we call blindness, where you're blind to what the screen says and you just click away. So this is a really good example of where public policy is doctrinaire, but fundamentally wrong. You want to inform people. You actually do want to inform them about what's going on. But to inform them in such a way that they don't read it is not only a waste of time, but guarantees that they're not paying attention. In cookies' case, cookies are in the process of going away. I'm sorry to say, Fred, as you love your cookie. And they're going to be replaced by other technology, which is sort of harder to explain. But I think that the overall statement would be that 10 years ago, I used to give this speech where I would say, you don't like what's going on the internet? Just turn it off. Take your phone. You know where the off button is. Turn it off. Have a normal life. You can't do that anymore.
No.
COVID has taught us something, which is that the internet is no longer optional. The behaviors that were tolerated on the internet 15 and 20 years ago, all the weird stuff, has been largely or is being addressed now. And if we've learned anything about COVID, there is a cost to misinformation in terms of lives and health that's not worth, that cost is not worth bearing. It's a bad cost. And so for people who say, oh, I believe in free speech and so forth, yeah, I believe in free speech for humans. I don't believe in free speech for robots. And so we're going to have to focus on the ways in which these systems communicate and that people can live with and come up with some compromise. The cookie question is the right question because it was the first example where the regulators took a doctrinaire position. They said, oh, look, we're great regulators. We can tell everyone every day and every day and every day that this is happening. And it did not achieve their effect. They need a better strategy.
I'll ask my sort of final question, lightning round. What keeps you up at night? What worries you? Is it trade wars, China, social injustice, the division in our country? We have a debt ceiling coming up in 12 days, 13 days. What are the things that you find really troublesome. And then I'm going to turn it over to Leslie. We'll let the audience fire away.
So there's a bad habit of tech people, which I have, which is to dismiss problems for which the solution is obvious. So you're an expert on debt and debt ceiling and so forth. The solution is obvious, right? So I apologize for my bad habit, but let's look at some things where the solutions are not obvious at all. What's going to happen is that, and again, we talk about this in the book quite a bit, the proliferation of these AI tools will allow not only everyone to be a publisher, but everyone to be a misinformer. And if you think your life is difficult now because you've got texting and WhatsApp and instant messaging and somebody called you and you don't remember where the phone is and then it's in your hand and then you've got this Zoom thing and you've got your friend Fred is on it and all of this is going on and you just can't deal, it's going to get a lot worse. And the reason it's going to get a lot worse is that the tools to manage your attention, which drives revenue or engagement or political outcomes, are going to be broadly distributed. And so the only solution I can come up with is that each of us is going to have a personal assistant. Think of it as a friend, a digital friend. Sorry to use a euphemism, that will sort of watch all of this and keep it under some level of control. In other words, my computer is going to fight your computer over whether you get the right of my attention. And your computer is going to do the same thing to mine. It's the only solution I've been able to come up with. I worry a lot about this because the systems that we're building they're learning how to get more engagement. And the best way to get someone's engagement is to frighten them. Fred, did you know that the house burned down? And Fred goes, no. And of course, that's false. And now all of a sudden, Fred's got one more thing to worry about while he's working, right? And I just got you, and I just got your attention long enough to monetize it. We've got to come up with a societal solution for this. The technology platforms that we're talking about are going to optimize for human brilliance, but also human failings. And I like humans, and I want us to continue to thrive.
Perfect. Let me turn it back over to Leslie. And I think we've got a bunch of people like some questions. So sorry, Leslie, we ran a few minutes over, but we also got a few minutes stalled start. So it's back to you. We can't hear you though.
Hopefully you can hear me now. Absolutely
Yes.
Fascinating. Thank you. You covered so many things. I'm very glad that you talked about the question of autonomy. And I know that in your report, you argued against a ban on autonomous weapons, which is clearly, going to be very contentious. And it's problematic, not least because many of the people arguing for the ban don't really fully understand the technology. Very few people understand the technology, and it continues to change. I'm going to ask you a quick question, and then I'm going to come to Yugar and Vasuki, and then Max, and then we'll come back to you and come back to the audience. And I guess my question is, you mentioned that you as a young person benefited from the National Science Foundation, that we had DARPA, that the US had all these sort of interventions that we don't associate necessarily with the free enterprise state that Fred spoke about so eloquently. And if, when you advise, which you clearly do through your commissions and through, I'm sure, multiple channels, if you were going to say to the Biden administration, here are the 3 areas where, despite a very contested political environment that don't necessarily, where there isn't a lot of reverence for directed government funding of research and innovation and all the rest of it, how do you get past that barrier, and what concretely would you call, or are you calling on when it comes to investment in technology and autonomy in a way that sustains the competitiveness of the U.S.?
So the first one I would emphasize is 5G. If you believe my analysis that we are a factor of 10 behind China, that means that the Chinese ecosystem will develop the kind of new killer apps on that platform that we would love to have. And I don't know about you, but I'm tired of my phone not working all the time. And the numbers are incredible. China has built roughly 700,000 5G base essentially towers. They're adding another 600,000 this year. Their objective is to get 1 gigabit coverage to 80% of the population, which is largely in the cities. I guess another 80% of the city coverage in the next few years at that kind of speed. That is an extraordinary technical achievement. They get this. The second point that I would make is this chip question. It is crucial that chip leadership remain in the West. And by that, I mean the specialized tools, these really, really powerful things. We need them because that's how we move forward. The chips are as important as the software, if not more important. And then I think the third is about AI. We're still very, very early. So when I describe AI as learning dynamic and raw and makes lots of errors, people are working really hard, for example, to improve the accuracy of AI. They're working really hard to get rid of some of the biases that are inherent in the way AI works. It's crucial that not only do we do that, but that we lead in it. And I'll give you an example. Let's imagine that the US decides this doesn't matter and China continues to focus on AI leadership. My own estimate is they're within a year of the West, and they get the benefit of open source. They have enormous resources going into this. Let's imagine that they invent general intelligence first, and they do it in a way that we can't figure out how they did it. Can you imagine the strategic advantage for having something which is a human-like level of intelligence running faster than humans for discoveries in physics, material science, energy management, national defense, culture, reach, strategic reasoning? It's a huge issue.
Very helpful. Thank you. Ugar, if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, I'm Ugar. I'm a member and UX designer and behavioral economist. My question is, what do you think about the data compression? Each year we generate and consume more data, but the compression technology, as far as I know, didn't evolve that much. I mean, it only evolved in TV series Silicon Valley, but each year when I check my data consumption, is getting higher and higher. Can AI help to reduce the compressed data we use so we can have better service on internet so we don't need to improve the infrastructure continuous like 5G, 6G, and other things? Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the answer is no. If you look at the rate of information generation, especially with IoT, everything will be known, published, and so forth that you could imagine. There'll be so much information. It's going to be overwhelming. So simply taking the data and compressing it might give you a 1-year advantage for a year, but it's not going to solve this problem. We're going to have to make our computers faster and our networks faster. We need to focus on communications. Much of the communications that we all depend on were invented at Bell Labs way back when. There's no analogous place right now. We need to focus on leadership globally in communications in all forms. And that means much faster fiber networks, much faster wireless networks.
Vasuki.
Thank you very much. A fascinating conversation. This is Vasuki Shastri, also from Chatham House. While I agree that it's very difficult for China and the US to decouple on the trade and supply chain side. And what we've been witnessing in China over the last 6 months is decoupling of a very different kind, both in terms of how the state exercises control over the economy, on this entire debate on wealth redistribution, on social engineering. Now, surely all of these domestic factors is going to impact on how China interacts with the world. And certainly the AGI point that you raised, Eric, would be one example where it would not be in China's interest to disclose more. So how do you think this is going to play out in the way China looks at the world?
I have many friends who are China experts, including obviously Dr. Kissinger. And the consensus of my friends is that China is adjusting so that the CCP can remain in charge, that their social model will retain the cohesion that they choose, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to achieve that. If you look at the leadership they have in surveillance, they have extraordinary technology in surveillance, especially they can follow your gait, they can find you, sort of anywhere. That's not technology that we want to be leading in the West. if you think about what's going on with Bitcoin, they have banned Bitcoin mining and also Bitcoin exchanges, most recently in the last week. And 2 or 3 years ago, China was more than 50% of all the mining in the world. Why would they do that? One answer, of course, is they don't like all the power requirements, but that's probably not true. What's probably true is they don't want money floating in and out of the country without some regulatory approval. If you look at the listing requirements that they put on Chinese companies, they require them to remain listed in Hong Kong or in China mainland. That's partly because they don't want all those dollars, if you will, floating around from the founders and so forth and so on. It looks to me like they're reasserting control consistent with their doctrine. So you sit there and you go, is that good for our side or bad? My own guess, which is not the common view, is that China will continue to do very well even with those restrictions. The Chinese government is very, very, it has the benefit of not having to run for office. They can think in very long-term goals, and they're clearly trying to maintain technology leadership, and they will do whatever it takes to do so. These are, in my view, not going to cause them to lose their leadership. Other people disagree with me.
Excellent question and an exchange. Max Beverton from the Tony Blair Institute.
Hi, yeah, it's Max Beverton Palmer from the Tony Blair Institute. Fascinating discussion. So a geopolitical question for you. We published a report last week on calling for like a new model of internet internationalism on similar themes. I wonder what you think are the geopolitical alliances that nations should be trying to build today to tackle these problems around collective cybersecurity and supply chains. And where do big tech companies fit into those new novel geopolitical alliances?
Well, first, I am no longer an employee at Google, so I'm speaking on my own thing. So when I speak for the tech industry, I'm speaking as a former executive at Google, not a current one. I am most impressed with these proposals for what is called the T10, T12, which is where the key technology generating countries in the West would collaborate. In our commission, we recommended a similar program run through the White House. There is a European analog that was endorsed by President Biden, and the European initiative there is good. So we need collectively to have a lot of communications bodies. The press likes to focus on the differences between the United States, Britain, and Europe. And there are differences. There are differences in rules about privacy and how you deal with consumers and so forth. But we are fundamentally strong democracies. You may not like the democracies, but we're strong democracies. And we have a strong doctrine around personal freedom, lack of surveillance, and these sorts of things. It would be terrible if these small differences between us, which get magnified by lobbyists and the press and so forth and so on, and the regulatory environment in Europe, would cause us not to unify around these key points. So I think there is a way to do this. And I strongly believe, and I know everybody on this call is internationalist in your outcome. None of you are troglodytes who sort of say, my country or the highway. You need cooperation to make this happen. It's the only way we'll survive against China.
I'm going to ask 2 questions from Adina Mufti, who has written in. And she says, first, does the Chinese government interference with Chinese tech companies reduce their competitiveness? And also, will the NSO group be held accountable for their spyware?
Okay, let's start with the first one. In my many visits to China, when I talk to my Chinese entrepreneur friends, I would say, it sounds like it's great. You're having a great time. You can just do whatever you want. And it's so competitive and you're winning. And they would always look at me and say, you don't understand what it's like to deal with the Chinese government. So there's always a possibility of regulatory overreach. It's always possible that the regulators, whose job is to regulate, as opposed to regulate and grow, which is the correct definition of what a regulator should do, it's always possible that the Chinese regulators could make a mistake. I haven't seen one that would cause me to believe that the growth rate and the pattern in entrepreneurship in China will be materially affected. Let me say also, as tragic as COVID was within China, China's brutal treatment of COVID allowed China to emerge starting in May or June of last year with extraordinarily strong economic growth relative to the West. And that growth rate has continued. What the second question was specifically? Do you mind repeating it?
It was about the NSO. And let's see if I can call this up. I think we've lost the question, unfortunately.
Hi, sorry to jump in. I can read the question out.
Thank you.
It's, will the NSO group be held accountable for their spyware?
I don't know. The problem with this sort of spyware is that it's hard to contain it. So once it was clear that NSO could do this, you have a problem not just of what NSO did, but also copycats. So I honestly don't know.
I'm going to ask another question from Rebecca Dugard. What do you think about how the AI tech, about how AI tech should be regulated in terms of making it open or closed/private? So AI tech regulation.
So I want to give an example to illustrate my frustration with regulation, having now spent 35 years dealing with regulators. You, as a principle, you want to regulate at the right time and not too soon and not too late. The European regulators in general always get this wrong. And a very good example is the following. So I led and was fortunate enough to lead an AI commission that focused on what the government should do, what the private sector could do, what the regulations should do, supportive building a response to China. It involves lots of money, lots of partnerships, and so forth and so on. The Europeans, in a similar period of time, developed a 200-page proposal for regulation, which doesn't describe any of the other things. It doesn't talk about how to build incredible AI companies in Europe. It simply tries to say, and the most important thing it says, is that there are critical aspects of the infrastructure that we all depend on, which will not be allowed in Europe to use AI unless it can explain itself. Well, let me tell you right now that the current models of AI cannot explain themselves with sufficient accuracy to pass a regulatory test. So as written, this stops the AI development in Europe. Now, I'm sure this will get fixed. But that's a good example. Another example from Britain. When Google was founded, which was about 20 years ago, deep linking, which is how Google works, where you follow the links, it was illegal under UK law. David Cameron's government actually had that changed. And I know because I was a business advisor to his government and I watched this thing happen. So you wonder, why did Google not get founded in Britain? Well, partly because it was illegal. So you want to be really careful about premature regulation. What the Europeans should do, and I'll be very, very clear here, is they should do a commission analogous to what we did in the United States. And they should say, where are going to be the most powerful uses of AI in our society? What are the problems? What are the appropriate restrictions? How do we get the industry to build? Remember, this stuff is developing largely in the private sector. So Europe, another example, about 8 years ago, there was a minister in Germany who proposed a regulatory law about platforms to regulate 35 platforms, 34 of which were US-based and one was Europe-based. So they're going to that's going to happen again unless Europe gets its act together to invest in AI companies. The reason I want to be so clear here is I've spent a lot of time in Europe and in Britain on this. The workforce is incredible. This is not a competency problem. The people are fantastic. This is a regulatory problem.
That's tremendously helpful. Thank you. Eric, we only have a couple of minutes left. And so I want to give you an opportunity. And actually, it's would be very helpful for us at Chatham House, especially, I say this with my hat as Dean of the Queen Elizabeth II Academy for Leadership. Your work through Schmidt Futures is very interesting to all of us. And it would be wonderful to hear just a word or two from you about what you do, especially in your RISE program, which I've read about. But before you answer that, I'm also going to ask my colleague, Linda Yu, to ask her question, and then perhaps we can close with that. And Fred, if you want to say anything as well, we'll let you have a few words. Linda, if you unmute.
Thanks very much, Leslie. And thanks very much, Eric, for a fascinating session. I think my question follows on from your points around regulation and US-China. I just wonder, with the US-China tension, leaving regulation aside, would you expect that to lead to more competition and therefore development of the AI sector? Or could it impede it if people are increasingly working in silos because of these various barriers?
The way software discovery works is it's pretty hard to contain. So if company X invents something, we were discussing this NSO example, the moment people see it, they say, I can do that too. So there's a natural proliferation problem, especially if it's something you don't want to happen. What I worry about is the inverse, which is I worry that the regulations, which are well-meaning, will stop the development of a solution. Over and over again, if you have an artificial prohibition, the engineers can't solve the problem because they don't want to violate the law, and the lawyers tell them they can't do it. So I would much rather regulate the end outcome. So for example, in Europe, using a specific example, it is illegal to have essentially biometric databases in private hands. That strikes me as a reasonable regulation, right? Because we really don't want people invading people's privacy like that. But that's an example of something that's very targeted, and it doesn't say exactly what, it doesn't say anything else. It just says you can't run things with that level of specificity. That's a legitimate democratic choice. A lot of these other ones will stunt the development of these industries.
Fred, let's have you ask maybe a final word from you, and also Eric, in your closing remarks, if you could just tell us a little bit about Schmidt Futures and about RISE and the work that you're doing there, because it really is very important to us and our audiences. Fred?
Well, actually, ending on the issue of regulation in somewhat, a regulator is nothing more than a referee between two competing interests. Sometimes it's the public versus the private. And of course, referees are never popular. They're not popular in sports, and that's why regulators. But I think you're on to one thing I think is key that I don't think we're grappling with, and that is finding that balance as a regulator, and also ensuring that we stay competitive. Because we talked earlier about China. If we can, in our desire to regulate and be within our own countries and markets, we may also make ourselves less competitive when it comes to dealing with China globally. And it seems hard to square those two. I don't know if you have any thought on that. And of course, we only have like 30 seconds.
All I'm trying to do here is say that there's a new competition in town. We tend to define the relationship between the transatlantic relationship as the key one. And it's obviously produced enormous value on both sides of the Atlantic, but that's not the real narrative. The real narrative now is that it's not only is it the rise of Asia, but it's the rise of Asian-built technology with a different set of values. We want the technology that we use to be built based on our values. The current tactics, which include losing in 5G, regulating AI in such a way that you can't actually build it, are anti-competitive and will allow the other side to make a lot more progress. In my long career at this, when somebody gets ahead of you, it's really hard to catch up. It's much better to just stay ahead and be reasonably ruthless as to what it's going to take to stay ahead in key technologies. And by the way, the key technologies are understood: energy, transportation, quantum, AI, synthetic biology. We know the list. Leslie, let me finish by saying a couple of things. First, I want to thank Chatham House for putting this together. Your institution's been there for far longer than all of us have, and it's a fantastic institution. Fred's been a close friend, and we should disclose this. And I really appreciate, Fred, you asking me to do this. And I want to work with you on Chatham House and other things, as you know, for the rest of our lives together. When I left Google, which was about 18 months ago, I got very interested in talent because I realized that my success was not due to my talent, but rather to all the people who mentored me, all the people who selected me, and all the people that I worked around. I was in an elite group by virtue of having been given these opportunities in front of me that I just blindly followed. And great minds, great leaders tend to change the world. And we know who they are, right? We understand that this exists. And so we called up our friends at Rhodes, who are, of course, the best in the world at this. And we said, let's do a program where let's see if we can find the smartest 16-year-olds in the world. This is an experiment. We'll see if it works. And the reason we were interested in 16-year-olds is there's a lot of scientific data that says that these exceptional people, their skills can be identified at about that age. And I'm not going to pass judgment on that. I'm just going to say that's what the data suggests. So we've run the program. We're about to announce our first cohort. One of our cohort of 16-year-olds, we had a very complicated set of tests. They're all incredibly impressive when you talk to them. Now, you know, they're 16-year-olds, so who knows? One of the 16-year-olds was a woman in Afghanistan who we were fortunate enough to get brought out before the fall of the airport. So we're really, really proud of that. So we're going to run this and see if we can develop a learning system, if you will, that learns how to identify the extraordinary sets of human talent and really make sure that we find it globally. We start from the premise, and I'll finish by saying that talent is distributed globally. It's true in Africa, it's in Indonesia, it's in Afghanistan, it's in the West, and so forth and so on. Some of those systems have really bad talent identification systems, and some of them have very good ones. We want to get everyone we possibly can to the table to invent the solutions to climate change, math, politics, leadership, great musicians, all of those things. This exceptional talent we believe can be identified, and we're running the experiment.
Eric Schmidt, Fred Hochberg, this has been fascinating. I have to say, I'm really glad that we ended on that. It's certainly aspirational, but it brings together not only your belief in the future, but your belief in technology and AI and identifying the leaders and the change within that generation. So it's wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us your time, your friendship. We look forward to an ongoing conversation. We look forward to reading your book, Eric, and Fred. For those of you who haven't read Fred Hochberg's book, you must take a look at that as well.
And Eric's book goes on sale November 2nd. You can pre-order. Pre-order is always important, so order yours today.
As always, Fred, you're a great friend. Thank you so much, everybody.